Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Nick Bowles. And before we get into the obvious number one topic in college football right now, which is the national championship game on January 13th between LSU and Clemson, I'd like to take a step back and give some real credit and recognition to Dabo Sweeney. And what I mean by this is not that I'm going to tell you that Dabo Sweeney is a great head football coach, because I think we all already know that. But what I would like to do is really give Dabo Sweeney credit for the program and foundation that he has been able to establish and build at Clemson. And to perhaps give a recognizable comparison, or to put this into perspective in terms of what I'm trying to say, I will use Nick Saban at Alabama. When Nick Saban went to Alabama, they were already a consistently good and established college football program. They were a household name in college football, and they had won titles in the past, and Nick Saban was coming into a situation where he was trying to take a consistently good football team and turn them into a great football team, which he did, and has made them the best college football program the last 10 to 20 years. And to sort of understand what Sweeney has done and why I would like to give him some real credit is he has taken a average to below average football program in Clemson and has essentially put them on that same level as Alabama in about half the time. I'm not sure if people are truly understanding how remarkable what Sweeney is doing is in Clemson. And I think maybe this is because when you get a once-in-a-generational type player like Deshaun Watson, perhaps many people expect you to win a title or two, or to at least go to the national championship game. But after seeing what happened last year and having his starting quarterback go out, and then having Trevor Lawrence come in, and for them to essentially not even miss a beat, and many would argue they actually became better, is a real testament to what Dabo Sweeney is going to be able to do at Clemson for the foreseeable future, and as long as Dabo Sweeney is at Clemson. And just to be clear, I don't think that Dabo Sweeney is going to leave Clemson. I don't think he's going to go to the pros, and obviously at this point he's not going to go to any other college football team or college football program. Once you become established and you are essentially the big man on campus, you can call the shots and you can essentially do whatever you want with the program. It's very hard to get that person to leave, as there's just not a whole lot of incentive or upside. And I think many people would actually argue that coaching kids or young men is probably actually perhaps more preferable than having to deal with NFL players and what we would just label as bigger egos and personalities. And there's obviously a lot more business involved in the NFL, a lot more outside influences. And given that Clemson has now been to the last game of the year for 4 out of the last 5 years, and the fact that Sweeney has been able to essentially recruit his butt off, and seems that he was going to continue to have a pipeline of 5-stars and 4-star recruits coming to Clemson, I think that Clemson is here to stay, and they are here to stay at the current level that they are at. That is truly a remarkable thing that many people probably don't get to see in their lifetimes even. Clemson is going to continue to be as good as long as Dabo Sweeney is there. Given the fact that he is in the ACC, which is obviously weakest of the Power Five, and I don't see a Florida State or a Miami really giving him any competition, and given the fact that he seems that he is going to be competing with Alabama for the best recruiting class year in and year out, I do not really see any major obstacle for Dabo Sweeney to get into the college football playoff every year. Compound that with the fact that he has shown he can coach in big games and beat the best teams. The future is looking very bright for Dabo Sweeney, and it is all because of the job he has done while he's been at Clemson. And for the reasons I just laid out, I really think Dabo Sweeney deserves some credit for not just putting Clemson on the map, but Clemson is going to be the best college football program for this coming decade, and that includes Alabama. And I think a lot of it may have to do with the path of least resistance, but at the same time, if you get into the national championship game and you beat Bama, there are no excuses. You leave no doubt in anyone's mind that you were the better college football team. So just to sort of wrap that up, I just really wanted to highlight the fact that I think Dabo Sweeney is truly on the precipice of doing some things that could possibly catapult him past Nick Saban in terms of being on that all-time record list or the all-time coaching list or the argument for greatest football coach of all time. And that's really saying some things. And as football fans, we should all really be enjoying it and consider ourselves lucky at the fact that we got to watch Nick Saban dominate for as long as he did. And it was immediately followed up by Dabo Sweeney at Clemson, who may do even bigger things or accomplish even more things in terms of winning titles and things of that nature. And also, many people forget that Dabo Sweeney lost 6 players to the draft last year, 4 of them on the defensive line, 1 defensive back, and 1 wide receiver. 3 of those players went in the first round. So that tells you the kind of talent that not only is Dabo Sweeney getting, but also the kind of talent that Dabo Sweeney is therefore replacing and still winning without. So the overall greatness of what Dabo Sweeney has been able to put together and achieve and accomplish at Clemson, I think should truly be recognized and appreciated. And I think it's just a little unfortunate for him that he's kind of having to come out of the shadows from Nick Saban, who, of course, in his own right, will go down as the greatest, if not one of the greatest head coaches in all of football, not just college football, but all of football. And unfortunately for Sweeney, he just happens to be the guy who is having to compete with Nick Saban at the same time. But I think within this decade, we will begin to see the Saban versus Sweeney conversation and argument in terms of who truly is or was the greatest coach of all time. And as young as Sweeney is, and the fact that he is in the ACC, he's going to have a path of least resistance. He is showing that he can recruit with the best of them, including Nick Saban. And just for the record, I know I talk about recruiting later on, but Clemson right now is actually currently beating Alabama for the best recruiting class this season coming up. And I think that just us as college football fans should really be acknowledging and appreciating the fact that we are probably going to get to see what will go down in the record books as the 2 greatest college coaches that NCAA football has ever seen, if Sweeney can continue to win and continue to stack the hardware and the accomplishments, which I think he will be able to do. So coming up in the next segment, I'm going to break down the national championship game. I'm going to get into more of the X's and O's, how I think it will play out, who do I think will win, and what do I think the differences will be that will lead to our next college football championship. So stay tuned and we'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, so last segment we talked about how I think Dabo Sweeney is not truly getting enough credit for the things he is building at Clemson, and not just in terms of him being a great football coach, but the ultimate legacy that I think he is going to eventually leave at Clemson, and how I think that it is truly going to rival the things that Saban has been able to accomplish during his tenure down in Alabama. Now, all that being said, and all the praise I just gave Dabo Sweeney for what he's building at Clemson, I am going to have to go against him in this national championship game. And real quick before we get into it and I break down what I think the key points are, the national championship game is 8 p.m. Eastern, January 13th on ESPN. And one important note to take is that it will be played at the Mercedes-Benz Superdome in New Orleans. Now, I don't think this is a big factor, but I think it is important to keep in mind that New Orleans is an hour or two away from where LSU plays all of their home games, down there in Baton Rouge. And while this may not be a big factor, it may not even be a small factor, I think on some basic level, it must play into the psyche of these LSU players that they are playing in their home state, they are playing in front of their family and their friends and their people, and that I think to lose in New Orleans would be a very, very disappointing feeling. It's not often that you get to play for a national championship, and even further, it's not very often that you get to play 2 hours down the road from where your actual home games are played. While again, I don't think this is a deciding factor by any measure, I do think when it comes to these players, these young men, I think there is a little more sense of pride and a bit of a feeling that they are playing for just a little bit more than a national championship, if that makes sense. Now, obviously, Trevor Lawrence and Dabo Sweeney, this is not their first rodeo. I don't think to them it means much that they're playing in New Orleans. They could play in California or Texas or Florida or Ohio or New York, and I don't think it would matter. It would be all the same. So, again, I don't think it's a big deal, but it is something to perhaps keep in mind. Real quick on the spreads, it's about a touchdown, 7 points in favor of LSU. Clemson's a 7-point dog. I would take LSU to win, and I'm going to also take them to cover the spread. I was able to get it at 6.5. I went ahead and pulled the trigger. Since the line opened up, 93% of the money has come in on LSU, which is quite remarkable. I thought perhaps 6.5 would be a lot, and that people would respect the past history of Clemson, of what they've been able to achieve in championship games, and that it might come down maybe even as low as 3 if enough people gave Clemson a fighting chance. However, that has not been the case at all, and there has been a heavy bet bet and button being pushed on the LSU Tigers. Both these teams are undefeated. Trevor Lawrence is coming in on a 25-game win streak. I think, obviously, LSU has had the better strength of schedule. I think they've had a little bit of a tougher road. And with all that has happened, I just get a sense of destiny with this LSU team. And I know you can't quite quantify what a sense of destiny is, but the way that they beat A&M and Georgia at the end of the year, the way that they just absolutely rolled OU, they just look unstoppable. And they had a very impressive win against Florida as well, and Florida ended up being a little bit of a better team than I thought they would be towards the end of the year. And I wanted to really quick sort of touch on the semifinal game between Ohio State and Clemson. This is kind of one of the reasons why I have LSU winning. Going into the Ohio State game against Clemson, I actually thought Ohio State would pull off that win. I thought that Ohio State overall had better athletes across the board, and actually I think they showed that, to be quite honest. Both of their running backs, I think, kind of canceled each other out. But I think the wide receivers and the overall athleticism on the offensive and defensive end for Ohio State was a little bit better than Clemson. But again, the X factor, Trevor Lawrence, when they first started out the semifinal game, Dabo Sweeney was running Trevor Lawrence a lot, and I thought that was a bad move. Obviously, I was wrong, as Trevor Lawrence kept pounding the rock, and he ended up breaking a few big runs. He obviously had the one big run. I think it was like for 60-plus yards for the touchdown. That really was sort of the nail in the coffin in terms of the game turning around. Obviously, right before that, you had the targeting call, which I thought was a bad call. Perhaps if you want to give him the helmet-to-helmet, that's fine, but I didn't think he deserved to be thrown out. I also thought that the strip fumble that was returned for a touchdown and then was called back as an incompletion, I thought that was a really bad call. So there were a couple bounces that didn't go Ohio State's way that I thought perhaps could have made the difference. But it is what it is. The game has been played, they settled it, and Clemson won. So why I bring up the semifinal game is the running back Robbins for Ohio State. And essentially, this was my thought going in to the national championship game, that if Clemson and LSU played, or essentially whoever Clemson played, I really think that the ultimate weakness, if you can even call Clemson having a weakness, but I feel that the weakness of Clemson is on the defensive front. Again, I mentioned it a little earlier about Dabo Sweeney and his recruiting and his ability to get talent. Last year, he lost 3 defensive linemen in the first round. In the first 17 picks of the draft, Dabo Sweeney lost 3 defensive linemen. I mean, that should really tell you the amount of talent that he is getting, but also the amount of talent that he lost last year. He had another defensive player, a defensive back, Trayvon Mullen, go number 40 in the second round. And he had another defensive lineman go in the 4th round, Austin Bryant. And seeing Robbins before he got his ankle injury, Robbins was essentially, running between the tackles. He was getting big chunks of yards. They were moving the rock. All they were having to do was hand it off. And I think that is ultimately going to be the difference in this game. And I know a lot of people talk about, well, it's all in the trenches, and I understand that, but it's a little bit more than just the trenches. And the fact that Clemson has lost so much talent on that defensive front, compound that with the fact that LSU essentially has the best offensive line in all of college football, and it looks like their running back is going to be back and is healthy. He seems to be practicing at full speed. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he seems to be coming back and will be available for the championship game. So at the end of the day, I think that's the difference. I think that is what I'm just going to call the X factor, or the crux of the game that's going to decide it for LSU. And I'm going to dive into the defensive fronts and how this game is going to break down even more in the next segment. Obviously, I could talk all day about this national championship game and these two teams and how they match up. So next segment we come back, I want to talk even a little more about how I think the X's and O's of the game are going to play out. So stay tuned. I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, last segment I was sort of beginning to break down the game, how I thought that the defensive line and defensive front for Clemson, the amount of talent that they lost last year, compounded with the fact that LSU has arguably the best offensive line in college football, and how I thought that ultimately is going to be the difference in this national championship game. And I was kind of getting into the semifinal game between Ohio State and Clemson, and the fact that Robbins, the running back for Ohio State, before he got his ankle injury, was breaking off some big plays for Ohio State, was opening up their pass game, and he was essentially picking up the first downs they needed. And there's nothing more demoralizing than when all you have to do as a team is just have your quarterback turn around, hand it off to a running back, and get 5+ yards a carry. So I think that will continue to be the case in this national championship game. And also it appears that LSU's star running back, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, is going to be healthy for this game. And to be honest, even if Clyde Edwards-Helaire was not going to be full strength or even available for this game, the backup running back, Chris Curry, who looked great against Oklahoma in terms of just having some explosion and running with some toughness. He had 16 carries for a 5.6 average, and even the third string, Tyrion Davis, had 4 carries for a 6.3 average. So, again, I think this really is a testament to the strength of that offensive line for LSU. And the way that Ohio State was able to run against that defensive front before Robbins got hurt is something that I think Ed Orgeron will try to replicate early and often in this game and try to set the tone for how he wants to control the ball. And I think that the way Joe Burrows also was able to throw the ball against Oklahoma will actually work in their favor even more. And I think Clemson will have that in the back of their head, or they will be preparing for it. And I think instead LSU will come out. They might show some pass, but I think early and often they are going to run the ball to try and dictate the pace of the game. And even further, I think towards the second quarter, towards the end of the second quarter, halftime, maybe early third quarter, if the running game is working like I think it will, and like how I think Ed Orgeron is going to do it, I think then you begin to see the play action. You begin to see Clemson have to commit a little more to the run. And this will open up things for Jefferson and that wide receiving core to make some big plays down the field that could ultimately end up being the difference in the game. So that's just how I see it going down. I think that is the main difference. I look for the key of the game to not just be the trenches, but be specifically the offensive line for LSU And the fact that that defensive front for Clemson has just lost a lot of talent, it's not their fault. I think they will try to do what they can to help out the run if it's working early. And unfortunately, I think that will maybe burn them once or twice later on in the game. And another thing I was saying, or as I was saying about this LSU team and sort of feeling like destiny, both of these quarterbacks I have total confidence in. I have no doubt that either one of them can get the job done. There's just something about, I think, the chip on the shoulder that Ed Orgeron has brought to this team this year. And I just feel like they do not want to be denied. And I think that has a lot to do with Burrows. I think he is someone who knows that this is the moment. And I know that he won the Heisman and he's going to the pros and things of this nature. And so I think he really wants to leave a legacy. I think that the rest of the team can probably feel that. I think they probably want to do it for their coach as well. Coming in, being hired from within, he was also doubted. I just think there is something about this team. They're going to get it done. They're playing for each other. And I know Clemson is doing the same. I'm not saying that they aren't, but they've already got a title in their back pocket. And kind of as the saying goes, winning one is not hard, but to win two in a row or to defend your championship is much harder the second time around than trying to be the guy coming for the top of the hill and you have all the motivation and you have the chip on your shoulder that you're playing with that can sometimes give you that mental edge. So if I had to pick right now, I would take LSU. I would even lay the 7 or the whole touchdown depending on what you're getting. And I look for LSU to run the ball early and often. I don't care if it's their first string, their second string, or third string running back. I think they're coming in. They're going to get physical. They want to send a message early and often that they're going to dictate the flow of the game. And honestly, if I had to pick an MVP for me personally, it'll be the offensive line. And I know that's not how it works, but just for me, I think the MVP of the game will be the offensive line for LSU. I think ultimately they win it for LSU. And in terms of a final score, the over-under right now in Vegas is 70. And I feel like that is a huge number. And just to give a little bit of context for the past games, since 1992, there have only been 6 games that ever went over 70. And some people might say, well, today's day and age and the way they throw the ball around and as many points as they score, surely those 6 times that it's gone over 70 were in more recent memory. Well, it went over 70 in 95, 96, 99, and remember these are all since 92, 2004, 2005, and then in 2015. And in 2015, there was 21 points scored in the last 4 minutes and 40 seconds. So even that game struggled to get over 70 in the end. So I would actually take the under 70. And I say that not just for the historical precedence of going over 70, but with LSU running the ball as much as I think they will, especially in the first half, I see that eating a lot of time off the clock. And if you're going into halftime with the score 14-14, something of that nature, then I think the under 70 is a good play as well. And let's not also forget that Clemson has an extremely talented running back of their own that I would probably say is their most explosive player on the offensive side of the ball that they will probably look to utilize as well. So I look for a heavy dose of running the ball early and often in this game, and I think it goes under. I think that eats up the clock. And so I actually feel better about the under 70 than I probably do about laying 7 against Clemson in a national championship game, seeing as they tend to constantly prove people wrong. So if I had to make some picks with Vegas, those are the ones I would go with. So that's how I see it breaking down. That's my picks. And just for the record, I was 26-13 this year in the bowl games, so I think that's a pretty respectable record. just so people know, I like to put a little money on the games, and it's something that I keep track of. So those are my plays in terms of the games, how I see it going down. And when we come back, I'm going to actually get into the other hot topic I think that is going on in college football besides the national championship game, and that is the topic of the Pay-to-Play Act going on right now in California and the broader scope of the NCAA. So stay tuned, and I'll get into that a little bit when we come back.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Alright, so last segment, made my official picks, went against the spread, picked them straight up, picked the over-under, kind of gave a breakdown, some more in depth of how I think the game will go down, how it's going to play out. So we will leave the national championship game there, and we'll move on to some other college football topics. This next topic is not specifically college football related, but it is college athletics related, and in the world of college athletics, obviously college football is king. So I want to talk about the legislation that California passed called the Fair Pay to Play Act, which is trying to let players make money off of their likeness, autographs, jersey sales, things of this nature. On its face, I don't think it's as black and white and simple as people would like to make it. At the end of the day, I would say that I lean towards being in favor of it. There's two sides to this argument. Essentially, you have one side who says to allow players to essentially become amateur pro athletes in college is going to ruin the sort of quote-unquote magical feel of college sports, this feeling of playing for something bigger than yourself, trying to leave a legacy, maybe where your parents went, playing for a university, playing for the name that is on the front of your jersey instead of the back. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. I don't think that they're wrong in believing that and wanting to think that, and I think there is truth in that. The reason why I tend to lean that I am in favor of this is mainly twofold. Well, threefold, really. A, I think kids are already making these kind of decisions on where they want to go to school, who will give me the most exposure, where can I get the most playing time, who has the biggest household name recognition. And so I think that kids are already sort of making these business and financial decisions in terms of what do they think is best for them as a player. I don't want to call it being selfish, but at the end of the day, these kids are going to do what they think is best for them, and they're not necessarily going to go to a school to simply enjoy the quote-unquote college experience of it. I also think that, as we've seen in the past, and we saw with the Nike scandal, kids are already getting some kind of kickbacks. They're already getting paid They're already making arrangements and agreements in the background, the smoky room, however you want to call it. And so whether people want to accept that or not, or we could argue over to what scale this is going on, I think a lot of this stuff is already happening. I mean, even with LeBron coming out of high school, you had the whole thing, what's to prevent a kid from taking out a loan when he's going to say, well, I'm going to the pros in a year or even less than a year. I'll be able to pay you back as soon as I sign that dotted line. These kind of things are kind of already happening. And so that's why I would like to lean in favor of getting it done and coming to some kind of agreement. And then the third thing is that I think it's inevitable. I think this whole thing is gaining momentum. And while legislation has just now been proposed, this has been a very hot topic in college sports for a long time now. And we're talking about 18-year-old kids. I keep calling them kids, but technically you're 18 years old. You're a legal adult. I find it very hard that they are going to be able to prevent people who are legal adults from making money off of their talent, off of their skill, off of their risk, off of their energy, and off the overall product that they are providing to the NCAA and to these universities that they are making tons of money off of. And I think it is just a matter of time before the athletes come together, both big and small, both the ones on the football team and the ones on the swim team, the ones on the basketball court and the ones on the lacrosse field and everyone in between. It's just a matter of time before these athletes come together, form some kind of players union, unionize in some form or fashion, and force the NCAA and these universities to come to the table and give them a bigger piece of the pie. So for those three reasons, the fact that kids are kind of already de facto making these decisions already, they're already sort of making a business or financial decision when they pick a school or university, the fact that it's also probably happening to some degree, in fact we know it's happening to some degree, and the fact that it's inevitable. I don't think you can keep legal adults from coming together to leverage the product that they are putting out there for these universities, and rightfully so. I think they should. And just to give you some numbers on the overall scope of college athletes, Division I athletics, and the NCAA, overall, Division I athletics, if you count every university, what they make off of athletics and the athletes, is a $10 to $15 billion industry. Let that sink in for a second. $10 to $15 billion in revenue. We are not talking about a small chunk of change. We are not talking about a small pie. We are talking about a massive industry, a massive conglomerate of universities and the oversight committee that is the NCAA. And we are talking about life-changing money in terms of if you were able to make some money for these major players off their likeness or jersey sales, it could possibly be life-changing money. Some other numbers, the NCAA alone as an oversight committee, remember, they're not running a university or anything. They have $1 billion in revenue alone. There are about 500,000 players in Division I athletics, around 19,000 teams. And just a little fun fact, there's actually more women teams than there are men's teams. I don't know why I thought that was interesting, but I mean, it's a small margin, but for some reason I thought that was a little interesting. So we're talking about a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of futures, a lot of risks that people are taking that they're not necessarily getting the proper compensation for in terms of the product that they are being able to produce and put out there that these universities and the NCAA are making money off of. So when we come back, I want to talk about just a little more sort of how I think this could work, how I think it could be fair, and we'll dive into a little more of the numbers a little deeper when we come back. So stay tuned.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right. When we had last left off, I sort of began to dive into this pay-to-play act that had been introduced in California. And also another side note, Oklahoma has also introduced some similar legislation in the state of Oklahoma as well. So, I think obvious the next state will probably be Texas, perhaps Oregon with the Nike CEO Mark Parker, places like New York and Florida. I think once you see a couple of these states begin to join in, I think this thing will really begin to pick up steam. And like I said, in my opinion, I think this is inevitable. I think it's coming. I think not only is it inevitable, but I actually think the transparency could possibly help a little bit in a weird way, in a kind of a backdoor way. I actually think perhaps just coming out and admitting that, yes, these athletes have monetary value that they bring to these schools, and we're going to give them a little kickback. We're going to allow them to make money off of the product that they quite literally as individuals are producing, that these universities and the NCAA are making money off of. And if I were just to kind of propose how I would do it, just sort of a quick breakdown without getting so far into the weeds that we have to break out a calculator or something of that nature. Let's say we just gave every Division I athlete $5,000, a check for $5,000 at the beginning of the year. They can use that to travel home to see their family. They can use that for food. They can use it for their car insurance. They can use it for a bus ticket home or to go see friends, whatever, right? I think essentially as long as it's not being spent on, tobacco and alcohol, I think essentially that they should just kind of be able to spend it on whatever their necessities happen to be. Now, the way I think it should work is, obviously you have someone like a Joe Burrows, right? Joe Burrows could go out in a heartbeat and make a lot of money selling his jerseys or autographs, or essentially what they're labeling as their likeness. And for the record, what I would do to begin with is I would not allow any outside companies or influences to be able to donate money to these kids in some kind of roundabout way. And what I mean by that is, hey, Joe Burrows, come to LSU and we'll put you in a TV commercial for this car salesman or for this car lot, and we'll pay you $20,000 to do it. Something like that. I don't think you should be able to do that. But someone like Joe Burrows can obviously make that $5,000 up in jersey sales or autographs and then some. So what I would do is you'd have the pool, right? $5,000 to every single athlete. Doesn't matter if you're on the swim team, the lacrosse team, if you play basketball or football, if you're a man or a woman. You just get whatever the set amount is for everyone, that's what you get. If you are able to make up that money on your likeness doing what we'll just call extracurricular activities, like the NCAA gives you a kickback of your jersey sales, or you're able to make money off some autographs, pictures, things of this nature, as long as it's not some inordinate amount from an outside company or financial institution or something that is more nefarious. If Joe Burrows is able to make that $5,000 up by doing his jersey sales or autographs or his likeness, then his $5,000 that the NCAA or the college wrote him would go back into the pool to be redistributed to all the other players. So essentially what this means is the players that are, let's just call them the Johnny Manziels of the world, since he was in a little bit of that controversy with his autograph, him and Jadeveon Clowney. Kids have done it all the time. The Ohio State players were selling helmets and jerseys for tattoos, things of that nature. These more popular players who can easily make that money, they are then giving that $5,000 check to go back into the pool and to be redistributed amongst the other players. So they are essentially giving their money back to go to the swimmers, to go to the lacrosse players, the soccer team, etc. The players or the teams who maybe are not going to be able to make that amount of money doing other things. Obviously, there's not a lot of people buying lacrosse jerseys or something like this. So that might be, it's just an example. Again, I'm not going to break out a calculator and start getting into the weeds, but I think perhaps letting what we'll call the stars of college go out and make as much money as they can, or whatever we set the limit as, off their likeness, and then therefore surpassing whatever that minimum amount is we're paying all the players, I think is a good way to raise the ceiling for the people who are able to make more money, and also bring up the floor for the lesser known players or the people who are not going to get as much exposure. And I think that's a good way to keep it fair. I think that's a good way to, the people who can make a little more money, even if you don't like it, can go out and do that. Again, we're talking about 18-year-old legal adults. That allows them to go out, make more money than they would, make a little extra on the side, and at the same time, they are bringing the floor up while also trying to get a higher ceiling for themselves. So that's just roughly how I would do it. That's roughly, I think, is a good idea. I guess perhaps maybe in another show or podcast, I can maybe get into a little more detail how I would break it down. But that's just kind of simply how I would do it, just kind of off the top of my head, or just sort of a skin deep thinking of it in terms of how could you let these kids make money without perhaps, being exploited themselves or taking advantage of the situation, having outside influences kind of manipulate what is going on. So that's what I would do. That's just sort of the gist of how I would do it. I'm going to leave that right there with the pay-to-play act, and I just really quickly wanted to touch on some recruiting. And before we get into this recruiting, I got a couple minutes before the next break. In college football, recruiting is the lifeblood of how good you can be. Recruiting is the lifeblood of your success, what your ceiling can be, and will ultimately decide the fate of your program in the near future. And I touched on Dabo Sweeney and how I think he is here to stay and why I think he's here to stay, and one of those reasons was recruiting. Right now for next year in the 2020 class, Clemson has, in this current moment, has 6 5-star recruits. Alabama's coming in with 3. Georgia's coming in with 4. Ohio State has 2. LSU 2. Texas A&M 1. Auburn 1. Texas 1. Notre Dame 2. Oregon 2. And Washington 1. Just really quickly, that should put into perspective the recruiting job that Dabo Sweeney is doing at Clemson, and how this is definitely a recurring theme that he has had going on at Clemson. His recruiting has been through the roof. He is doing an amazing job. This is why I have Dabo Sweeney possibly having the opportunity to rival Saban in terms of a legacy and the overall history that he is going to leave at Clemson. Recruiting is everything in college football. In my opinion, it is 60 to 70% of determining how good your team is or can be. And when we come back, I will go into just a little bit further about recruiting, another bright spot and another example of recruiting that I would like to touch on in terms of showing the difference it can make and how it can determine your future. So Stay tuned, and I'll come right back.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Back. Last segment, I finished up my thoughts on the Pay-to-Play Act, how I might break it down a little bit. I plan on maybe going into a little more detail on that in another podcast. I also talked a little more about recruiting, how well Clemson has been doing compared to everyone else, and again, why I think that is one of the main reasons why Dabo Sweeney is going to do as well as I think he is going to do in this coming decade. I mentioned that there was one more bright spot in recruiting that I wanted to touch on, and perhaps a better way to frame that is how important I think recruiting is, and an example of that, and that's Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M. You know, one of the reasons or one of the factors or qualities that a head coach must have in college is to be able to recruit. And to be honest, you know, if you have a college football coach or you bring in a new guy, me personally, I am not so much worried about the X's and O's. Don't get me wrong, the X's and O's matter, of course. But what I want to see in a head college football coach and program is I want to see how you recruit. How good can you recruit? That will be the biggest determining factor in how good you can be. And before Jimbo Fisher got to A&M, of course had some good recruiting classes here and there. They had a few good players here and there. You know, I think when people think about really good players, I think A&M gets overlooked a little bit. I mean, he had Myles Garrett, Von Miller. Even though Johnny Manziel didn't pan out in the pros, they've done a pretty good job of some recruiting. They haven't quite had some good classes or some overall high-ranking classes, but they've been able to get, you know, sprinkled in a few really talented players here and there. Since Jimbo has been at A&M, he has had top 10 recruiting classes both years. And I think that in the next 2 or 3 years, I think you will see A&M also make one of those leaps or one of those jumps. Will they rival Alabama? I don't think so. You know, obviously Alabama is a whole nother animal. But they're never even going to have a chance until they start getting in some recruits. And say what you want about Jimbo, what he's done so far, or what he's done on the field, he has been recruiting his butt off. And I believe this will begin to pay dividends for A&M in the next year, maybe two. And there were a lot of people who gave Jimbo flack for leaving Florida State and going to A&M. You know, why would you go from a program that you won a national championship with and go to A&M, who hasn't exactly had the resume or the hardware to make that job seem like such a good move or a better move than what he had at Florida State. And say what you will or what you want, but he has been able to recruit at Texas A&M, and I also believe he, too, is building somewhat of a foundation there, and it all starts with recruiting. And so far, that contract he's been paid, the move and everything, so far it's been worth it just based on the recruiting alone. Just based on what he's been able to do the last couple years, I would say that the move has already been worth it. I would say that the long and short of it I would say that the long and short of it is to say that the risk so far has been worth the reward. And the reward is the fact that you are in the top 10 in recruiting every year now. And it looks like you're only going to improve or perhaps even get better classes in the near future if Jimbo can continue to do this. And to be honest, that's all you paid him for. You are just paying your college coach to recruit. If you're an average coach, but you can get a top 5 recruiting class, you'll be top 10 in the nation every year. If you can get the players to come to your school, if you can recruit these kids out of high school, get these young men to buy into the program and come to your university, we're talking about timeline-changing moves. We're talking about certain things that will take your university to the next level, and it all starts with recruiting. And so far, Jimbo has done that. Okay, to close out this podcast, I thought we'd have a little fun. I'm going to make some predictions in terms of conference winners in the Power 5 for next year. Some that may surprise you, others may not. And I will start with the SEC. And to me, surprisingly, I think this is one of the more difficult picks. Burrows is leaving. Alabama has their new quarterback. I do not think there is a clear-cut winner in the SEC next year. And I unfortunately have to kind of just go with a default pick, and I'm going to go with Alabama. And so nothing really exciting there, but I just want to make it clear I do not think that the SEC has a clear-cut winner next year. In fact, I think we could see a lot of parity in the SEC next year. If one of these quarterbacks for LSU or for Alabama doesn't really pan out, or the coaches are not able to develop them to that next level, you could see some surprises in the SEC next year. It might be a down year for the SEC next year. Who knows? So I actually think SEC, while typically it's a pretty clear-cut, Alabama 1 and LSU 2, and then whoever can fall in behind that, typically that's the outlook at the beginning of the year. I actually don't know. I'm not quite sold on this new Alabama quarterback. I think he's looked good at times. But again, we'll see. Sometimes these guys look okay. They just don't end up panning out. They don't have the head for it. They get injured. Who knows? So LSU is going to be in the same boat. And, I could easily see one of those two teams having a quarterback that doesn't quite pan out the way they wanted, or is not able to win them those big games when they need it most. So the next one is, we'll go ahead and move on to the Big 12. This is actually one of my more surprising picks, I would say. I'm actually going to take the Longhorns to win the Big 12 next year. Ellinger just declared that he's coming back. I think he has a good senior year. Texas was really hurt on the defensive end of the ball this year with injuries. I think in the Utah game, they showed you the potential that they had. If they can have a healthy year next year, if Ellinger can not really even take that much of a step forward. I mean, if he can just improve a little bit, I think he could even possibly be in the Heisman running. Who knows? I mean, I honestly think that Texas could have a pretty good year next year. Oklahoma has Hurts leaving. I'm not a huge believer in Baylor. Although I really like their coach, I'm just not sold on them being a clear-cut favorite next year. And with Hurts leaving Oklahoma, and Texas has their quarterback coming back, who I actually think is a very good quarterback in all honesty, I'm actually going to pick Texas to win the Big 12 next year. ACC, that's an easy one. I think just by default you have to take Clemson. And also another side note on Clemson and recruiting, they have got for next year 7 out of the top 30 recruits in the nation are going to Clemson. They have the number 1 or number 2 quarterback. So again, they're going to have a guy learning a year under Trevor Lawrence. 2 out of the 3 top recruits in the nation are defensive linemen, and they're going to Clemson. So again, Clemson's going to be stocked. They're going to be reloaded. I'm just going to pick them by default, even though some of those recruits probably will take a year or two to develop. In the Big Ten, I'm going to take Ohio State. I actually think Ohio State and Clemson will play for the national title next year. I think the quarterback for Ohio State will take a leap forward. I think he'll improve slightly. And I actually look for Clemson and Ohio State to play for the national championship next year. For the Pac-12, I'm going to take Oregon. I like the Washington teams, Washington and Washington State. I could see perhaps one of them, winning a bounce of the ball here or there and winning a couple big games when they need it against an Oregon or each other. Or Utah. I just don't think Utah has going to have the horses to beat Oregon. In the championship game, obviously Oregon beat Utah, so. In the Pac-12, I'm going to go with Oregon. That's not too much of a surprise pick, although I think the Pac-12 is a lot closer than people would like to admit. I think Washington and Washington State are good teams. I think Utah is a very good team. I just see Oregon being slightly better, so I will go with Oregon. But again, Pac-12 is like the SEC. I honestly do not see a clear-cut winner in the Pac-12, and so I actually think the Pac-12 should be an interesting conference to watch next year along with the SEC. So those are kind of my picks for next year. I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. Thank you for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, write a nice review. That really helps us, boosts our numbers up, gets our name out there. And also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we'd really appreciate that. Again, that's a big help to us, and that's always appreciated if you guys can do that. So thank you for listening, and hope you guys have a good day or night, depending where you're at, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.